how does perfectionism show up in your life? Are you a workaholic, or were you a workaholic before your breakdown? Do you have super high expectations of friends, colleagues, children, people close to you in your life, but often find them lacking or disappointing? What about yourself? Do you have super high expectations of yourself, but often find that you are very disappointed, cross, angry, or full of rage at your own level of imperfection, even though you have tried extremely hard to be super brilliant at something? In today's video, we're going to be focusing on those topics. Additionally, I'll also be sharing some examples from my own experience of perfectionism and how that was showing up in my life, how it contributed to my breakdown, and then how I've worked with it following my breakdown to try and ease and soothe it. And that hasn't been an easy job, believe me. And then I'm also going to be sharing with you some tips on how you can work with your perfectionism to understand it, to identify it, and also to soothe it. So welcome to the Spirit Spa, an online sanctuary dedicated to supporting you if you're in the early stages of recovering from a nervous breakdown, helping you to identify why the breakdown happened to you and to work out your next natural steps towards rebuilding a flourishing life. So have you managed to identify how perfection is showing up in your life? In my last video on perfectionism, I took you through a process to help you I do that and identify those areas. And if you haven't done that already, I do suggest that you probably pause now and go and do that video. The link will be below, and work through that and then come back to this video. So how does perfectionism show up in your life? So for me, it shows up constantly before my breakdown and after my breakdown, and still as being quite a workaholic. And not just kind of a workaholic that kind of spends long hours working, which I do, but having like massively high expectations of myself in terms of the quality of work that I actually produce. And I will keep going and going and going and going and going with a project until I kind of have that inner sense of it kind of having reached a certain level of perfection. But of course, the reality is that I probably could have stopped the work quite a long way before that. But there's something driving me that kind of wants to take it to a kind of a level beyond what it needs to be. And then kind of pushing myself and exhausting myself, draining myself in the process. This also used to show up when I was a school teacher, and I would spend long hours in school with the students. I was a theatre studies teacher, and so they often had to rehearse shows for exams, and I would be at school with them until like 11 o'clock at night, diligently rehearsing until kind of every single aspect of their production was absolutely perfect, to make sure that they got as close as they could possibly get to get their A grade or their C grade or whatever it was that was going to be a high level of attainment for them. But actually, that was kind of how I was working pretty much close to my breakdown, and I'm fairly convinced that I was probably taking myself way beyond what I needed to be doing in order to care and support those children. And of course, it's important to notice with that not only was I expecting high levels of perfection from myself, I was also having incredibly high levels of perfection for my students as well. And of course, I was doing that in quite a nice way, but nevertheless, the message was, we're going to keep going at this until we're perfect. We're not going to be good enough. We're going to be absolutely perfect with this. So yeah, that's kind of like a couple of ways that it showed up for me. If I'm honest, it also shows up in relationships. I'm absolutely certain there have been times with my own daughter when I've probably had very high levels of expectations from her that I probably didn't need to have. An example that I can think of is table manners. I was such a perfectionist with her around table manners, and I look back on it now and I feel quite sad that I was so strict with her and probably didn't make meal times as enjoyable as they possibly could have been, because I was so focused on making sure that she was doing everything absolutely perfectly, so that when we went out for dinner she was doing it all properly. I'm really upset with myself for doing that now, and I would do that very differently with hindsight, but at the time it's what I thought I should be doing. I should be raising this perfect child. And I'm sure that put a lot of pressure on her that really wasn't needed, wasn't fair, and possibly at times probably wasn't kind either. I've absolutely no doubt that I have been massively perfectionistic in terms of relationships, where I've probably had very high expectations with partners along the way. Possibly, maybe I haven't been as patient as I could have been at times. Maybe I've been very dogmatic in terms of what I expect, rather than actually being open to listen to other people's feelings and needs. Certainly maybe we can all do that as we look back and, when we were younger. But yeah, I probably had quite rigid views on and expectations around perfectionism in relationships, which set the bar way too high for some people, I would imagine. And I possibly maybe didn't give people as much of a chance as they possibly deserved. Having said that, I probably also had very high levels of perfectionism in myself in relation to making relationships work, which then meant that I actually spent time in relationships that were completely dysfunctional, and I should have ended before they'd even started, but I stayed in them for way too long because I was completely dedicated to kind of creating a perfect relationship with this person, and working on it and working on it and working on it and working on it, when I should have kicked it to the curb a long time before it reached that stage. I think what's really important to reflect on there in relation to that level of perfectionism in relation to external aspects of your life is what that's actually doing is portraying actually what's going on internally. So of course, when we're having these very high levels of expectations and perfectionism in our outside world, it's actually because there's something inside us that is working incredibly hard and driving us and forcing us to believe that this is what we should be doing. And often that's unconscious. We don't realize we're doing that until we get to a point where we have a breakdown, and then we have to start becoming very conscious about what's happened to us, why has it happened to us, what impact it's had on our lives, where is the responsibility, and all that kind of stuff. So often for years before our breakdown, we're going along quite happily being very perfectionistic towards others and ourselves without really thinking too much about it. But it's only after the breakdown when we realise the extreme debilitating impact that it's having on our mental, emotional, physical and spiritual well-being that we really come to a point where we need to think about it and to become kind of much more gentle in relation to perfectionism. In my last video, I did invite you to spend a few moments thinking about how perfectionism makes you feel, where the pain is, how does it make you feel, and how would you like to feel in relation to perfectionism. And perhaps this is a good opportunity just to remind yourself of that, come back to that, think about how does it make you feel, and how would you like to feel instead. Because I think once you've identified those feelings, you kind of know where you're coming from and where you would like to get to, even if you don't know how you're going to get there yet. And I am going to be sharing some tips with you on that. But if you don't know how you're going to get there, at least you know where you would like to be, even if you don't believe that you can get there. But, let's be optimistic and trust that you are going to get there. But you can't get there if you don't identify those emotions. So how was it showing up emotionally for me and intellectually for me? I think it was showing up in such a brutal fashion, and it was quite a revelation to me once I began to become aware of this kind of inner brutality that was going on in relationship to perfectionism. It was incredibly torturous, and it was kind of almost addictive. It was very hard to let go of it, and even today I still have to work on it. But yeah, I think it was probably very lonely actually as well. I think perfectionism creates quite a level of isolation because you're sort of ostracize yourself from like certain elements of your life, if you like, because you're so busy working hard. And that isolation, it's not just an external isolation in your world, but it's an inner isolation as well, like an inner loneliness, because you never feel worthy, you never feel like what you're doing is good enough, not just for others, but actually also for yourself. So there's this constant loop and spiral downwards of being disappointed with yourself, cross with yourself, saying quite nasty things to yourself, even if you're not aware that that's what you're doing. But quite often there's quite a very negative loop going on in your mind around what you're actually saying to yourself about these tasks. And even when you get to a task where you completing a task where you do think it's perfect, or as perfect as it can be, because we perfectionists often never find the perfection in the piece, you still don't think it's good enough, and you still want to kind of tinker with it and improve it and so on, instead of kind of just giving yourself a break and letting it go. So for me, it was this strong sense of self-brutalization, this strong sense of immense disappointment, this real kind of drive, and which was exhausting and took me to a point of exhaustion a lot of time. Even before I had my breakdown, there were many moments where I would reach exhaustion and just in complete collapse, because I was working so hard all the time at being so perfect, which of course I never was, by the way. So yeah, and then this like massive isolation, and I think probably the other thing is that loneliness, it kind of gets to a point where you sort of disconnect from others, because people aren't as perfect as you would like them to be. The world isn't as perfect as you would like it to be. So you kind of sort of step back and withdraw. And I think it also comes down to trust as well. I think you begin to lose trust. You lose trust in yourself. You lose trust in the world. You kind of often come up against quite disappointing experiences because they haven't been as perfectionistic or perfect as you would like them to be. I'm going to talk a little bit more about trust in another video, because I think that's incredibly relevant to this issue of perfectionism. So let's examine where perfectionism comes from. It's not rocket science to work out that actually it begins in childhood, and it's often as a result of our experiences with our primary caregivers. Maybe we have very stern primary caregivers. Some people who've had a nervous breakdown, it's often they've had quite abusive primary caregivers. But at some point there has been some kind of primary caregiver, which could be a parent, it could be a teacher, but somebody that you've had quite close to you in your life, who makes you feel completely rubbish about yourself, who is constantly maybe criticizing you, perhaps speaking incredibly derogatorily, I can't say that word, perhaps speaking to you in a not very nice way, let's say it like that, and putting you down maybe. But of course, it's not just verbal. You know, we all will have had experiences with people in our lives, particularly when we were children, with adults, where it can like just be a look, or it can just be a raise of an eyebrow, or it could just be a you know, these little non-verbal gestures that can communicate to a young child, you are not good enough, you are not doing well enough, this is not up to my standards, we want better, we deserve better. You know, all of these messages that you learn in childhood, which teach you you're not good enough, you're not likable, you're not lovable, and you're not worthy because you're not doing these things well enough and good enough. And I'm sure that you can all think of lots of examples of that in your own life. However, I'd also like to invite you to contemplate on another reason for perfectionism, because although often it comes from our primary caregivers, I'm almost going to cut them a little bit of slack, because I actually believe that it's not just our primary caregivers that have suddenly decided that they're going to start behaving in this way. Often their behaviour is very unconscious. And of course, the reason for that is because they've inherited these patterns. A lot of our perfectionism relates to messages that have been passed down through the ancestors. And for whatever reason, whether it's been for survival reasons, whether it's been for work reasons, whether it's been for, you know, domestic living situations, there are many, many reasons our ancestors lived in extremely difficult, stressful, frightening times where their life, their liberty, their survival was really, really in jeopardy. And so they had to be really, really like good workers, or, you know, whatever. They had to work really hard in order to make sure that they didn't lose their jobs. They weren't thrown out of their tied cottages and so on. And of course, that gets passed down through the generations, even when it's no longer needed. Perhaps at one point it was a very needed survival strategy, probably not needed now, but it's still there in our ancestral patterning. So I do invite you to approach this from a perspective of compassion, that often, and But may I just say that I'm not saying that, like, if somebody has horrifically abused you, that you need to suddenly become all kind of, floaty and loving and, happy about that. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm sort of inviting you to kind of just look at the bigger picture in terms of ancestral patterning and ancestral history, because it was really useful for me to do that when I was stuck in blame in relation to primary givers. Once I was able to just step back a little bit and begin to look at society, history, ancestral experiences, it really began to shift something for me that meant that I was able to let go of a little bit of my pain and my rage in relation to certain things that primary caregivers had done. So I'd really like to share that with you as an invitation to explore that in quite an open-hearted and open-minded way, because it might just be create a really positive shift for you. If you do find it creates a really positive shift, or anything that I've discussed in the video so far creates some kind of real helpful insight for you, I'd absolutely love for you to share that with me, either in the comments below or by emailing me at karen@karenpackwood.com. It's always very interesting to know how people work with this material and the positive impacts that it actually has on their recovery from their breakdown. What do you think causes perfectionism? What do you think causes your perfectionism? Personally, I think it's actually fear-based, but I'd be very interested to know what for you is kind of like the primary emotion underpinning your perfectionism, and where did it come from? What emotion was going on within you that made you feel that you had to become a perfectionistic person? So how can you work with perfectionism in a way that can begin to, for you to be really understanding of how it's showing up in your life, how you can alleviate it, and maybe even how you could actually eliminate it completely? I'd like to share with you today's tips on how to begin to work with your perfectionism, understand it, alleviate it, and potentially eliminate it. I do have more tips than the one that I'm going to share with you today, and I will be creating future videos on those. But today I'm just going to share with you a sequence of activities that you can do to begin connecting with it more deeply. So once you've identified how perfectionism makes you feel and where you would like to go emotionally with it, I'd like you to start keeping a chart on where perfectionism is showing up in your life. So I'd like you to kind of begin to map the different types of perfectionism that show up, where it shows up, what triggers it. Is it something somebody said, or is it something that's going on internally? And how does it make you feel once you're in that state of a perfectionistic drive? So for example, with me, I know that when I'm working on a piece of writing, and of course the perfectionistic part of me really comes to the fore at that point, although I've learned to work with that in a much kinder way now. But there's no doubt that that's like, I'm absolutely driven to make sure that every single word that I'm writing is absolutely perfect. However, what I've then had to learn to do is to give myself permission to write absolute rubbish, because often the perfectionism shows up to a point where it can actually stop you beginning the writing in the first place, and you just think, well, I'm not going to write anything because it would just be rubbish. It's not going to be at that perfectionistic level instantly. And that's a journey to go through. So now I just say to myself, right, perfectionism shows up as soon as I sit down at my desk. I know that. It shows up as soon as I lift up my computer lid or pick up my pen. I know that. It's kind of like there instantly that I have to jump to a perfect piece of writing. I know that. I didn't know that, by the way, 2 years ago. It's been a learning curve. And now I just say to myself, I'm going to give myself permission to write absolute rubbish. And once I've said that, it helps me to just kind of begin to write absolute rubbish, which is how my writing always starts. It always starts off as complete rubbish on the page, and then I work it out from there. So yeah, that's just one kind of example of when perfectionism shows up for me. So when does it show up for you? Keep a chart, just for a week maybe. Keep a little chart of where perfectionism shows up and how it shows up. Once you've completed your chart of where perfectionism is showing up over a sort of a week, shall we say, I'd like you to take just one element of perfectionism, and we're just going to work with that. Then, of course, you can repeat this activity with all of the other elements if you want to, but you might find that you don't need to. But I just want us to come into a sort of a closer conscious connection with one aspect of your perfectionism. So just choose one element from your chart to focus on for this next part of the activity. And now what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to begin journaling on that one component of perfectionism. It doesn't have to be perfect. This is just notes. It can be doodles. It can be a sketch. It can be anything that feels right for you. But I just write it down on a piece of paper. You could do a brainstorm. Put whatever that element of perfectionism is into the middle of a circle. Let's just say for me, like writing an essay or writing a piece of creative writing. Put that into the middle of the brainstorm, and then just jot down how it shows up, when it shows up, why it shows up, how it makes you feel. What does it look like? It could be quite interesting to actually begin to see, does it have a shape? Does it have a form? Is it an animal? Is it a person? Is it somebody that you know? Have you got kind of like an inner perfectionistic kind of person hanging around inside you that resembles maybe somebody who actually kind of demanded that you were perfectionistic at some point? Or maybe it's like an inner sort of like archetype of some kind. So, for example, when I was working on this, I began to identify that I had this perfectionistic element of me that was female. That's quite interesting to know. Is it female or male energy? And she was female. She was quite a big woman, quite a strong woman, and she was like an engineer. She was tinkering away, or more like a mechanic actually, but she was tinkering away with all this machinery, and she was kind of like absolutely determined that she was going to fix this machinery. I'm not even convinced that the machinery was broken, but nevertheless she was working very, very hard, very diligently at actually mending this particular engine. So can you find that within yourself? How is the perfectionism showing up in relation to this particular incident? Is it male? Is it female? Does it have a form? Is it an animal? Is it is it a tree? What is it as an element of nature? Just how is it showing up? Draw it, and then just write to it. How does it make you feel? Colour it, or if some creative writing is coming to you. Some poetry is coming to you. What wants to be said? And don't be perfectionistic about that. Just let whatever wants to be written on the page be written, and you might be surprised by what comes forward. And once you've done that journaling, which you can do over a period of a few days to really come into strong, close connection with this element of your perfectionistic personality, if you like, what you can then do is make some decisions around how you would like to begin to alleviate, soothe, or eliminate it. And one of the ways that you can do this is you can do it by actually asking the perfectionism, what is it that you need? What is it that you are looking for? What is the emotion that is going on underneath the perfectionism? Because of course, as you know from my videos, you'll know that it's really important to try and helpful to try and get down into that kind of root feeling, because once you've got that, you can then begin to work with it, heal it, love it, soothe it, and so on. So can you dig down into that particular question? And if you're able to ascertain how your perfectionism, what it would like from you, what it would need from you, are you able to give it to it? You don't have to if it doesn't feel right or authentic to you, but maybe you can. Maybe there's something that you can do to honour what your perfectionism has asked you to give it, to soothe it, to help it alleviate the agony of being a perfectionist. Alternatively, you can actually begin to take control and make some decisions yourself in relation to the perfectionism. Where do you want it to go? How would you like it to be? So in relation to my own experience, what I decided, by the way, I gave my perfectionism a name. So you might want to give your perfectionism a name. My perfectionism was Diva Darling. And So I decided that Diva Darling, who was kind of making life quite hard for me, and the more I came into connection with her, I realised just how hard she was making life for me, how much she was sabotaging my life, and how much she'd kind of been sabotaging my life before my breakdown, and was still very strong in her presence following my breakdown. And so I decided that I actually wasn't going to give her as much attention as she was demanding, because it was very demanding. So I actually decided she needed to go on a holiday. So I actually imagined a very beautiful location for her to go on, and I took her in my mind, in my imagination. I took her to this particular location. I imagined her sitting in a bar. She had a very nice drink with her, and I gave her permission to relax and be on holiday. And what was very interesting was that once I'd done that, once I'd sort of visualized and imagined the transition from her being like really focused on mending that machinery to putting her into a nice relaxed bar with a nice drink, with some nice music, with nice sunshine around. Interestingly, it was in Russia though. That was very interesting, but anyway, it was in Russia. But anyway, once she was in that bar and she was very relaxed, it was almost like she slumped, and she was really grateful to be given permission to let go, to not be the perfectionist anymore. Because of course what that actually meant was I had come to a place where I could trust myself to do whatever it was I needed to do without having to be brutal to myself, without having to be a perfectionist. I didn't need her to be in my life anymore, if you like. So I was very grateful to her because she'd been very protective and she'd helped me. Diva Darling was the one that really helped me get me through my breakdown. So I was extremely grateful to her. But then nevertheless, it had gone too far, and it had become a brutal relationship, which sounds funny to say, but it had. And so I needed to take her away and, put her on, give her a holiday. And to this day, she's still on holiday in Russia, and I don't really let her come anywhere near me in relation to any of my writing work, because that was where she was really showing up big time. So what about you? What would you call your perfectionistic part of you in relation to the element that you've chosen to work with today? What is it that they need, and what is it that you need from them? Where do you need them to go? Do they need to be going for a walk on the beach? Do they need to be having a very long sleep in a really nice snuggly bed? Do they need to be skiing? Do they need to be swimming? Now these might be things that you are not physically capable of doing at the moment because of the state that you're at in relation to your breakdown recovery, but that doesn't mean that your imagination can't go there. It doesn't mean that in your imagination, your perfectionist element of yourself can be doing all sorts of incredible things that perhaps you yourself can't do at the moment. And maybe you might even begin to find that enjoyable and fun and playful, which is very, very different to the energy that we have just leading up to the breakdown, where we're kind of, we don't even know that we're having the breakdown initially, do we? But then immediately afterwards, we can be quite brutal on ourselves in sort of demanding ourselves to recover quite quickly, when actually that's not what we're meant to be doing at all. So, maybe even become a little bit more playful with your perfectionistic elements of yourself, and swap perfectionism with playfulness. And maybe that's a really great, positive, healthy aim for you to have. And I would love to know if you do that, wherever it is that you choose to take your perfectionistic elements. I would love to know if you do take them on some quite wonderful adventures, or whether they're sleeping peacefully beneath a tree. It would be so nice to kind of build up a picture of where all of this quite formerly brutal, perfectionistic elements of a person's psyche are now kind of languishing in these beautiful and much more serene, playful, tranquil states. I mean, that would be such a lovely thing for me to know. So I'd love you to share that with me by either in the comments below or emailing me at karen@karenpackwood.com. If you would like to continue working on this as we come to the end of this video, you'll see that I actually have attached this video to the nature meditation that I created last week to help soothe perfectionistic energy in a person's body. And so you can just very smoothly transition into journaling, sketching, watching, sleeping, resting with the soothing perfection nature meditation. Do watch out for future videos where I'm going to be giving you some more tips on dealing with perfectionism. If you've liked today's video, please press like, and if you are not a subscriber, please do subscribe, and welcome to the new subscribers that have joined us this week. You're very, very welcome here. Please do say hi in the comments box below, or again email me at, once again, Karen@KarenPackwood.com. But remember, this is the Spirit Spa. It's an online sanctuary dedicated to supporting you if you're in the early stages of recovering from a nervous breakdown, helping you to identify why the breakdown happened to you and work out your next natural steps towards recovery. And please remember, recovery is possible. So as we go into today's nature meditation, I'd like to wish you all a very peaceful week, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.